Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Mubarak to our Muslim brothers and sisters. Namaste. Good evening to all members of the Guyanese diaspora, and especially to Guyanese at home. We hope you are, taking care and you're all safe with your loved ones. So tonight we would like to bring you another episode, and this episode is being brought to you by Globespan 24x7, which is run by Nohar Singh and a technical team headed by Devin out of Queens, New York. So just to put things in perspective, we would like to continue with the discussion we had over the last 2 weeks. We have been talking about the evolution of the ethnic problem in Guyana, thus the title of our show, A Nation Divided. The last session, we talked about some of the possible solutions. So today, we would like to continue by looking at some of the possible solution to this impasse, this sort of a political crisis in which we find ourselves. At the same time, we would like to keep the focus on this notion of political power, because we think that's an important concept to consider when we look at the situation we're in Guyana today. Now, just to put things in perspective, we are now in day 57, I would say, in this political crisis. So we're 57 days ago since the elections was held. You take a country like South Korea, they have about maybe, I'd say about 30 million voters. It took them 2 days to figure out who won the election. So we are still in this impasse, and we can understand, the fact that Guyanese are very, if I can use the word, pissed off, and that seems to be something that's going to continue, because we know if you're looking at the media reports today, CARICOM arrival is being pushed back. But we will continue regardless of what happened in Guyana. We will continue with this discussion because we think it is an important discussion. So tonight we have our returning guests, Dr. David Hinds, Mr. Ravi Dev, and we have 3 other guests who will join us tonight. You will hear from them a little later, but they're here and they will participate in our discussion. But I'm just going to remind them, as well as our 2 main guests, that we would like to keep our discussion or this political discourse focused, concise, and to the point, so we can get as much out of all of you as possible. So let's go back to our 2 guests, main guests tonight. Dr. David Hinds is an associate professor at Arizona State University. He specializes in Caribbean and African diaspora studies with an emphasis on race and ethnicity. He's authored several books, and he's published a number of articles in academic journals. David is also a very active member of the WPA. He has been there for about 40 years. He's well known as a newspaper columnist. As I said the last show, David was also arrested under the PNC regime. David hails from the historic village of Buxton. Mr. Ravi Dev. Mr. Ravi, can you guys hear me?
I can't see David.
All right, David is on now. So just a little bit of technical snafu, so hopefully we can correct that. I just introduced David Hinds, so let me just say a few things about Mr. Dev. He has a BSc in economics. He's a member of the New York Bar. He was also a corporate executive and an entrepreneur who actually owned a building in Queens and a supermarket in the Bronx. He told us he gave it all up. At least that's what he says, to return to Guyana. And in Guyana, he was a member of the Jaguar Committee for Democracy, which was active before the 1992 election. And as a member of ROAR, he was leader of ROAR, and he was also a member of parliament. He writes for the Guyana Times, and Mr. Dev hails from Ifrat pasture. All right, so now with the introduction of those 2 gentlemen, let me just say a couple of things about Ferlin. Ferlin, you've seen him on social media. He's a philosopher, and he's many things. Micheal Philander is a biologist, a student in Guyana. Robert Cuffy is a co-founder of the Socialist Workers' Party. So these gentlemen will help me to try to get some answers from our 2 guests tonight. So, gentlemen, let's get right into it. So my first question is to Mr. Dev, since the first question that the last time went to Dr. Hinds. So Mr. Dev, here's my question to you. Let's say if we can resolve the scenario in which we're in Guyana. Let's say by some miracle we have a verified count and a winner is declared, whether it's a coalition or the PPP. Can you play out the scenario as to what can possibly happen at that point in Guyana?
Well, firstly, I think we have to be very clear that the premise that you're making as to this count will be completed, it's a very large assumption, because based, if the past is any programmer to the future, I don't think this recount is going to happen anytime soon, if at all. As we can see, there's been constant delays. There's been constant subterfuges to cause these delays. There's been constant recourse to the courts on matters of technicality rather than the substance of the law itself. And so for various reasons, I think this count in itself is going to be very, very problematical, more than it has been up to now. And that is not an inconsequential fact, which is that this will tend to deepen the divisions that were imminent before the elections and has deepened every day while we've dragged this thing out for 50 odd days. We have passed the 40 days and 40 nights, which is the biblical expression for a long time. So that in itself, let's consider that by the time this thing is fished, if ever the count that is, this would be a very, very polarized society. I see that the PNC, as it is doing right now, in game theory, there's something called gambling for resurrection. That when you are losing and it's a rational choice to say, well, I have nothing to lose. Right now, the PNC has nothing to lose rationally from a pure power standpoint. I will come to the question of power by saying, let the count go through. Because from all indications, if they knew they were winning, and everybody knows from their own SOPs, they would have released those SOPs and had this matter settled. So by looking for resurrection, what happens in game theory is that the losing side will then use whatever, create a diversion. And in this case, I think that the African constituency that by and large has remained faithful, just as the Indian constituency has remained faithful to the PPP. I think they will agitate within that community and to emphasize that all is lost. There will be nothing there for us. It's going to be presented as an all or nothing situation. So I don't see the PNC, if they're lost, that they will let go. On the other hand, the PPP, if they lose, or in fact, if they win, because the power centers are all controlled by the PNC, the army, the police, the people's militia, the cadet corps, the bureaucracy, these have all historically been aligned with the PNC. And after being now riled up about this historic injustice, I see that the PPP will be on the back foot. So while if they quote unquote win, they will have authority, but not power. And I think that, of course, will be very problematical. And we'll have to deal with those contingencies.
All right, David, the same question I'll pose to you. Play out the scenario if the count, let's assume it's done, and it shows the PNC, the coalition wins, or if it shows the PPP wins. What can possibly happen?
Well, I think neither side will accept the results. That has been known before the election, although we try to ignore it by holding on to our democratic forms. Historically, neither side has ever accepted the other side as the winner. They have allowed the other side to govern and I say allowed in brackets. But with this election being so high stake, neither side would accept the victory of the other side. I don't want to say what I think would happen because in the atmosphere that we're in, people interpret your prediction of what will happen as if you are saying and willing people for it to happen. So I will stop there and I will say neither side would accept the result of the election. At the moment, both sides are claiming they're winning. We don't hear the coalition side much because they're not as loud as the PPP. And so therefore, we tend to think it's only the PPP which is saying that it's winning. The other side is saying it's winning. Both sides are saying it's a disputed election. The PPP is disputing Region 4, and we tend to hear that because it's very loud. But the other side is disputing Region 2 and Region 3 and Region 5 and Region 6. I have said a long time ago, it's a disputed election, and it's a dispute that is not, in my estimation, going to end well. And I'm not single on that. The Prime Minister of Trinidad said so. He said this is not going to end nice. History tells us it's not going to end nice.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Deb, and I appreciate you guys trying to make your response concise. So, Mr. Dev, if we are assuming that this is not going to end well, we've had 28 years of one. David seems like he's frozen. All right. Hopefully, David can hear us. But
yeah, I am hearing you.
Okay, because your screen seems frozen.
Yeah.
So my question to Dev, and I want to go back to a scenario here. There's something called institutional memory, right? Many of us know that we had a 28 years of authoritarian government, and David, you were in prison. You were opposing that system, and then we had another 23 years of another political party. Again, a different ethnic group, if you want to look at it that way. So we have a great number of years that shows us that there are issues that we should have addressed. So my question to Dev is, from your estimation, why didn't the PPP, for instance, address some of those concerns in anticipation of where we are today?
Well, before I answer the question, I just want to say, and this is part of our dilemma in Guyana, that if we make certain points, you'll be seen to be taking one side or the other. That's one of the consequences of a polarized situation. But when David said that neither side has ever accepted the other winning, that's not really true, because in 2015, the coalition of the PNC/APNU with the AFC did win that election. And the PPP, while it filed an election petition, it did accept them coming into office and went back into parliament and participated in their governance. So we must accept, and that is not, again, it is something that we must now understand, that for the longest while, the PNC being in leading a minority had what was called the African security dilemma, that if they played by the rules of the game, they would never be able to get executive power. But 2015 proved that was now something from the past, that in becoming a coalition with the AFC, they were able to change. So I don't think we can simply brush that under the rug. It is something very important that we should come back to if we are to ever address and resolve this crisis. But what was your question? Let us get back to that. I want to make sure I'm on point with that.
Well, if we had a long history of of struggle, you have people like Walter Rodney, fighting against an authoritarian government. We had 28 years of a history that's not a good history. We had 23 years of history again following that. So when do we learn from that process? We had, since independence, we were in a situation. So if we're seeing now that you have one side are saying, look, we're not going anywhere. And the other side will say, hey, when the results are declared, if it's not in their favor, they're not going to budge. So my question is, why are we in this situation?
One of the major reasons is that we know that your theory about the world, your worldview, will have a great influence in proposals that you will put on the table to address the problems, because they are defined by your worldview. So we had these early leaders, starting with Dr. Jagan, Mr. Burnham, Dr. Rodney. They were all Marxists, and they saw the problem from a Marxist perspective that gave quite short shrift to race. So, for example, coming back to the PPP, in fact, felt that if you had economic development, that in and of itself will then lead to a dissipation of this ethnic politics. So they were using a tool that they were very certain would lead to a solution. But we have seen across the world, we had the USSR, 70 years of trying that particular method of changing society, and it went nowhere, because after 1989, the USSR split into 16 or 18 republics, all of them ethnic republics. The point I am making, therefore, is that we have to be careful in the present, hence my acceptance to be part of these discussions. We have to be very, very directed in that history, to know that we just can't pluck any old solution that because it worked in Northern Ireland, or because it worked in Bosnia, or because it worked in wherever, that it'll work in Guyana. We have to understand our own society, and we have to find a model that is suited to our peculiar circumstances. We're not all different, but we are different enough that we know that whatever the PPP and the PNC tried in the past, there are yet these very, very deep divisions. But I said what has given me hope is that in 2015, there has been demographic changes. You know, the quantitative demographic changes, I think, are leading to qualitative changes as to how we see each other. And that is something I'd like us to pick up on after I finish, maybe later in the program.
All right, so I want to come back to this question of political power. Max Weber talked about, he kind of defined power in the sense that a government has power when one, that government is seen as being legitimate, right? Whether it's through an election, which is generally the case, right? Secondly, that government should have control over the institutions of power, whether it's the bureaucracy, the army, and so on, to implement its power. And the third thing has to do with its ability to deliver resources. So my question to David, I want to come back to what you had written about in your one of your columns that raised a storm. If we define power in that sense, and if we have, let's say, as you recommended, David Granger being the president for 2 years until they can fix the problem, right? Do you see any changes in those institutions during the 2 years that you're suggesting in this power arrangement or this power sharing arrangement?
Beto, let me say, look, we have a tendency in our discourses to pick things out of a comprehensive proposal and highlight that thing. In 1961, when a Marxist, E.U.C. Quayana, put on the table power sharing in the form of what he called joint premiership. He saw the problem from an indigenous standpoint, and he put on the table long before Leipart and Horowitz. He said neither ethnic group would allow the other to govern. And he put on the table joint premiership. Then he used the term power sharing. And he said, look, if the two leaders reject that, then we go to partition as a last resort. The proposal came to be known as partition rather than joint premiership. And we only get to college or in premiership 30 years later, when younger generation like myself argue strenuously on the political marketplace that, look, the proposal was about power sharing. And I say that to say that my proposal was not about Granger. It was not about destroying boxes. My proposal was that we are in the midst of a disputed election. And as all of us here agree, that the recount is not likely to lead to an outcome that is going to please everybody. In fact, as we all agree, the recount may not even end. And I was preempting that by saying, okay, why don't we postpone these elections for 2 years? I didn't use that term. I said scrap the elections. But in effect, what I was saying, postpone the elections for 2 years and take those 2 years and work on the problems that we should have been working on for 40 years, which is to create a political environment where we could have democratic elections that are accepted by all. That was my proposal. It was not about Granger. It was not about that. And I just put it up and say, well, Hinds, what's your details? And then you give details and people take one detail and run with it. You know, so the question here is whether the leaders and the society are ready to make that leap. I don't know. From the time I made my proposal to now, I can conclude that I don't think they're ready. At least certainly the PPP has made it very clear. PPP and their supporters, they said, we're not ready to talk about fixing problems. Count the votes, have a result, and then we may talk about that. The other side has been silent. So one can conclude that they're not ready for my proposal. All right? As I said in an answer to Sister Arjun last week, when the PNC was in power and they were not counting the votes, eventually we arrived at a solution for that time before counting the votes. The Carter was able to come and broker an agreement between the PCD, opposition PCD, and the PNC for a free and fair elections, which would mean a new voters list, a new elections commission, and they were able to do that between 90 and 1992, 2 years, with the PNC in power. And Hoyt, being the WPA before the PPP and the PNC to be in power, but the PPP didn't want them, so Hoyt remained in power for those 2 years, which was effectively an interim government. And we were able to get a new elections commission, a new voters list, and then we went to elections in 1992. So the model of counting the votes before a solution, we didn't use that in 1992. And I am not sure that in 2000 that model will lead us anywhere. I think we've got to broker a political solution, and all the leaders have to be ready to do that before we move forward. In 1992, they were ready. The PNC on the Hoyt said yes, the PCD said yes, and they were able to broker an agreement. In 2020, I'm hearing the PPP say no, and I'm hearing nothing from the coalition. So I'm not hopeful.
But you see the dilemma here. I mean, we've had so many issues in the past and we try to address them. But in 2015, you know, we had a change of government. And in 2020, based on preliminary, results from what I'm seeing, it seemed as if the coalition did get crossover votes. And it seems like the PPP did get crossover votes. So my point is, if this was the game, this was the rules of the game that you entered into, as you did in 2015, why not play by the same rules in 2020 and then change the rules because one side feel that the election is not in their favor? Do you see the problem?
You're asking me that question. I have no stake in that. That's a question you should ask the PNC and the PPP, and I'm sure they will tell you they're playing by the rules.
But David,
what I'm saying, I am not giving a lot of credence to crossover votes and all those things. In 2015, we did not have crossover votes. we had Indian Guyanese who voted for the AFC. Crossover, it meant they had to go to the PNC. And as shown, once they got into power and they saw that the PNC was controlling that coalition, they withdrew and went back. Crossover means that you have to have a critical mass of voters who are crossing over from one ethnic party to the other. That is not what happened in 2015. What happened in 2015 is similar to what happened in 2006. In 2006, Africans left the PNC and some of them voted for the AFC under Raphael Trotman, an African leader. By 2011, with the formation of the APNU, they went back to the PNC/coalition. And the same thing happened in 2015. Crossover votes are temporary in these kinds, and then people are not crossing over. They're crossing to a certain point. During the civil rebellion under the WPA and led by Rodney, Africans participated in undermining the coalition in the WPA, not the PPP.
Okay,
and when elections came in 1992, they left the WPA and went back to the PNC. Similarly, Indians will come to the WPA in 1992, went back to the PPP.
So let's go back to 2015.
Let's
go back to 20, but that's not really true for 2015 because according to Moses Nagamutu, he says he's bringing in 11% of the Indian votes to win that election. But here's my question to you, and if you can answer this briefly, and then we'll move on.
I mean, listen, as the moderator, could we have a bit of an equal exchange here? Could I have a question?
Do you want to take a shot at that? Go ahead.
Well, it's because I thought that's what we're trying to do here, to have a kind of a discussion where David is representing one, let's call it tendency, and another. I think what we're seeing here, David, and I think I would like you to please give it how do I put it, the attention that it really deserves. That in politics, as in all social institutions, matters are not static. They are changing. They play out in history. So what we are seeing here is from the very beginning, we felt that you have these ethnic groups competing for power at the center. And there were many proposals put forward to get them to have this collaborative effort. One of the suggestions, as I pointed out, that was made as far back as 1963 by the British, was to introduce proportional representation, even though they wanted to get Jagan out, but their rationale was a valid one, which is proportional representation allows minorities to vote for their own, and therefore coalitions could be formed. Forbes Burnham used the opportunity in '64 to form a coalition because of the demographic and because of the electoral system. By 2015, after people like myself, as I will say it again, between 2009 and 2010, insisted publicly that the demographics were changing, as Bob Dylan said. The times were changing, and that if the PNC were to moderate its approach and to seek alliances, the PPP, it could be a situation where the PPP could be defeated. And lo and behold, that occurred. So it is not a contradiction in and of itself for politics in an ethnic society, because one of the points we always make in having consociational devices is what you call centripetal devices, things that will push the different groups together inside. And coalition is one of those things, that you coalesce with somebody from the other side, and therefore you have to moderate your own position, your own stance. I'll say it, I said it before and I'll say it again. The PNC has no one to blame for this impasse but itself, because after coalescing with the AFC, because they accepted they got this 11% of Indian vote that Pedro was talking about, not given to the PNC, given to the AFC, but the AFC brought that in to the coalition. But for the PNC not to accommodate his behavior through his appointment to the cabinet, through its appointment to the boards, through its appointment to all the institutions of state, through its buttressing of the army and the police, through then its close of sugar. It was totally not only blind, but it was totally, I would put it, contemptuous of the concerns. Matters, it didn't help matters that the AFC itself didn't give a damn to stand up for those concerns. That's another thing. To your credit, and to other members of the WPA, in the early years, you did raise your voice as a member. So to come back to it, I think I would like to say this again, that while the PNC's action has damaged coalition politics in Guyana, I would not like us to bury it. I think the possibilities still exist because of a fact we can't sweep under the rug, which is we are now a nation of minorities. And if the PPP were to win, let us say, or the PNC were to win, I will accept either one. And I think the Guyanese people are beginning to accept that if they don't do as they promised, then we'll vote the so-and-so out. We'll vote them out of office. I do think we are at that historic junction. But the longer this impasse is kept up, I think we will move away from that. I don't want to use words like trust and all those fancy, symbolic terms. I want to say very concretely that we must get this thing over and give this new dispensation a try.
Better if I will, and I'm very glad Ravi clarified, because we are talking about two different things. We're talking about coalition politics, which I completely support. It's why we've taken so much blows when we joined the coalition with the PNC, and the AFC is taking blows because of a belief in coalition politics. And I see that as the future of Guyana. I've always seen that. That is not necessarily crossover vote, right? So my objection just now was to the term crossover vote, not to coalition.
It forms the same function, right, David?
No, it's not crossover. It's bringing votes together.
Yes,
bringing votes together. What I call ethnic rebellions. There are always ethnic rebellions going on in the different ethnic groups. And it is the ability, I think, of either side to take advantage of that rebellion and frame a national coalition out of it. And yes, the PNC failed miserably in doing that. And I'm saying, given what I hear coming out of the PPP and being pushed by their supporters, I am not convinced that the PPP, if it wins or is declared the winner after a recount, will embrace coalition politics.
Well, let me. I want to bring our guests in, right? So, but I have one question to Mr. Deb before we move on. Since we're dealing with this issue of power, there was a letter in one of the local dailies. This is on the 23rd of Kaichur News, and I want Mr. Dev to respond to this. So here's a quotation from, I believe it's a Pastor Joshua Emmanuel. Basically, he says, our people control the security forces and the bureaucracy. In addition, our people control the capital city, the seat of economic and political power. Our party has the capacity to bring down PPP government anytime, as we did so many times. Should we have learned from this lesson? And here's a very bold statement being made in broad daylight in the newspaper. Mr. Dev?
Well, it's a broad statement, but it's a very accurate statement as to what the status quo is all about. And it's something that we've been talking about since we entered the scene back in 1988. The point is that when leaders make decisions in terms of power, they will consider in a very rational sense. Power is the ability to get someone to do something. You can use moral suasion, and you hope they'll do the right thing, as Spike Lee once said. But more crucially, you will consider what are the power resources you have behind you. And if those power resources give you the option of stonewalling, which is what the PNC always had because of historical circumstances and because of what Mr. Burnham did during his turn at the wheel that he huffed, as we say. The present administration has those institutions at its command, as Mr. White said, as the kith and kin. So in evaluating what his response, the PNC response will be, they are pretty sure they will have the backing of those institutions, because I don't think Mr. Granger has to call those individuals in GCOM who would look at the other side or do a little bit of skullduggery here or not. And this is not, I wouldn't say they are evil people, but this is the nature of ethnic politics. That when matters are placed that this is the survival of quote unquote your people, people will flex, and we must not be surprised. I'll tell you this, as I mentioned before, during what was called the African Freedom Fighters based in Buxton, when Andaye and people like David Hinds said, not in my name, there were calls for that to wipe them out. And when the army was sent in, many people, including myself, was opposed to that. And people wondered, why would Ravi not want the army to go in and clean up? But you were talking of sending an institution whose members were drawn from not only the same social strata, but from the same ethnic group, the same elements there, to go and tell them, shoot them, do what you want to do. And you were now going to put your army under a set of circumstances where their loyalties inevitably will be pulled aside by Magnus. And when I had that discussion with the Army Officer Corps, some of them must now be running the GDF now because it's 20 years ago, they accepted that. So when certain army patrols didn't go after and shoot certain bandits, you get me? It's not that because they are evil. We have to understand what we're playing with. So come back to your question. When that gentleman points that out, that is a fact of life. And we as Guyanese people must accept that the PNC is being rational. As I said, they are practicing what is called gambling for resurrection, expecting that they have those cards in their hand.
Pedro, I will ask for a minute to respond. Right?
Can you make it a minute?
Yeah. No, Ravi's absolutely correct. But Beto, you should have also quoted from numerous testimonies, which from Indian Guyanese, who are advocating that agriculture and food and the economy be used against African Guyanese if the coalition were to be the winner. To use Indian dominance in the agriculture sector, Indian dominance in the commercial sector, in order to do the same thing that man said Africans should use. Look, both ethnic groups are located in key areas of the political economy. And both ethnic groups have shown a capacity to use their location in order to undermine whichever government is in power. Many people are today amazed at the two independent dailies which are now lined up behind the PPP. And Africans tearing their head, the hair off their head. We don't have a black newspaper. All right. We are noticing the role of the media in this and the ownership of that media and the role that it is playing here in pushing the agenda of one side. I just give that as an example that both sides have leverage in critical areas of the political economy, which they will use and they have used in order to undermine the other when they're in power.
But I think David makes or elides a very crucial distinction in political science and in politics as a whole. And this is the distinction between power and influence. When we talk about power, as I said, power is ability to make someone else do something outside of their will, whether they want to or not. And those institutions that are controlled by the PNC, the state institutions, they have been given legitimacy by the state to do that coercive act. So, for example, if a policeman pulls me over and hauls me to Leonora police station and tells me sit on that bench, which happened a few months ago, whether he is right or wrong, I had to obey because literally they could shoot me. They have the, as Weber said, they have the ultimate sanction of death over the citizenry. What Indians have, as you said, they own certain businesses, certain sectors and all that, that gives them a certain amount of influence. You understand? But you see, influence is something that is not a one-to-one. The person may choose to go along or not. So, for example, when I came back to Guyana, all these so-called big Indian businessmen, some little clerk in a government office could take away their license. And similarly now, that if you want, let's say the sugar, the rice industry depends on certain governmental functions, for example, D&I. And if you can squeeze them any which way. Look at the taxes that are being imposed on sugar rice farmers because you control the bureaucracy. You can tax them, you can take away their land, as happened in West Berbice. You can do any number of things. So we must always keep in mind that when you have the power, when you have the institutions of the state at your disposal, that's power, and the other is influence. And there's a very important distinction.
Yeah, but Ravi, you know that influence tempers power. But that's another discussion for another time.
I'll be tempted to cut your mics off, gentlemen. So let's all right. So I want to bring in our guests in. You know, let me just remind you guys. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask you. You know, let's be very concise and very brief with the questions, because the more questions you ask, the more response we'll get from our two guests. All right. So Ferlin, you're first.
Thanks. Dr. Hinds, you've been quite the controversial figure lately, and I myself have responded to your very controversial letter that you issued, the one where you made the statement about destroy those boxes, cramp the elections. There are a few things within that letter I want to ask you about, and I haven't noticed anyone specifically in the public forum that has addressed these questions besides myself. But to make it publicly known for our audience, I want to read just two very brief quotations that you made reference to in your letter. You said, the post-1992 democracy was characterized by a most dangerous ethno-domination by the elites of one ethnic group and extreme marginalization of another. I assume you mean that the most dangerous ethno-domination by the elites of one ethnic group, I assume you were referring to the PPPC. And when you speak of extreme marginalization of another, I assume you're speaking about Afro-Guyanese in relation to the Indo-led PPC. Now, further down in that letter, and I'm going to conclude at this point, you said, many African Guyanese blame the African Guyanese leadership of the WPA for overthrowing our own dictator and empowering the dictator of another ethnicity to once again enslave African Guyanese. Now, I'm also assuming here that when you say overthrowing our own dictator, you're referring to the PNC reign prior to 1992, the Burnham era, and having that Burnham era be overthrown with this PPPC post 1992 elections. My question is this: you called for power sharing in that letter, and I'm curious to know, why would you want power sharing between two political parties who have contributed, as you say, to the enslavement of African Guyanese?
The answer is simple. Those are the two parties the people vote for. Indians vote for the PPP, Africans vote for the PNC. You know, other parties like Roar and WP and so on put ourselves forward. They don't vote for us, they vote for them, right? So you have to have power sharing between them. It's strange that you're asking parties that operate as historical enemies to share power, but that is what we have. If you look at all ethnically divided societies, they have to make peace among themselves. It's the Palestinians and Israelis have to make peace. You can't wish them away. In the same way, we can't wish the PNC and PPP away. They're there. The electorate has shown no propensity for moving away from those parties. I think what has happened from time to time, there are ethnic rebellions within the parties, within the party's bases. And it is up to us who are keen political people to spot that and try to push it in directions so that we can have a kind of ethnic peace. But above and beyond everything else, you have to deal with those two parties. And that is why coalition is inevitable. And Ferlin, I've only been controversial among Indian Guyanese. Right now, African Guyanese love me. They didn't love me before 2020. I was controversial to Africans between 2015 and 2020. And Indians loved me because I was beating up on the government they didn't like. After 2020, when I'm not beating up on the coalition anymore, Black people like me. And Indians think I'm controversial. It's not about me, Ferlin. It's about the society that we live in and the way in which ethnicity determines when you're controversial and how you're controversial. I'm not a controversial person, but in our ethnic environment, I become controversial depending on my viewpoint and whether it sits well with one side or the other.
So, David, we can say that you're speaking for all Africans, not just.
No, I'm not speaking for all Africans. African Guyanese have always had problem with my worldview, starting with Guyana, coming through Rodney period, right down to the present period. Our tendency has always been problematic for African Guyanese, although there are times when they embrace our worldview. But I'm not speaking for African Guyanese.
Okay, because I'm a little confused because I know Rohit Kanai, in one of the recent articles, he said, according to David Hinds, Barnum people and Quantas people are now one. So I don't know if that's the reality in your.
Would you want me to respond to that?
You can come back to that. I want to get to Micheal.
No, but you introduced it, Beto.
I'll give you a chance.
No, you introduced
go ahead.
it.
All right, you want to take it? All right, go ahead.
All right.
Why don't you answer that and we go back to
that statement was made when some of us in the WPA, when the APNU was first formed in 2011, we visited the African villages on West Coast Bobis. And older African Guyanese came up to us and said, brothers, thank you all for this APNU, because for the first time in decades, we don't have to choose between Kwayana people and Burnham people. You see, the split between Brother AUC and Burnham in 1971 really left a scar in the African Guyanese community. And they saw the coming together of the coalition as that. My brother wrote it as a way of reporting, you say something. All I was doing, I was reporting what Africans told us.
All right.
So
let me get back to Micheal. And
did
again,
I clarify that for you, Beto?
well, you're not doing it for me. You're doing it for the audience also, right? Because I'm just one person.
You quoted Rohit as an authority.
No, you did. You clarified that for me. Thank you. Thank you. And again, let me just remind our guests, we want to be very brief with the question. You know, if you can avoid the prefacing and get to the question directly so we can get to more questions. So, Micheal, you've got the floor.
Okay, so good night, everyone. My question is directed to Mr. David Hinds. I'm sorry, Dr. David Hinds. So this question is based on, well, Walter Rodney's ideology of the centripetal force that Mr. Dev touched upon last time was in bringing the labor force together. And that struggle in there and would have ultimately brought both ethnicities together from a labor perspective. So my question to you is, why was there not more done on WPA's behalf when the sugar workers, they got laid off and there wasn't any solution for them to go on to anything different?
I don't get your last part of your question, the sugar workers part.
Yeah, so my question to you is that why did WPA not play a major part as it relates to like providing something else for the sugar workers who were laid off to go to? Because in essence, that would have been a labor struggle that could have probably united the WPA people with the East Indian sugar workers in what Walter Rodney was basically advocating for many moons ago, as in relates to a labor struggle.
First of all, you have to be very careful about Walter Rodney and who you get your information about what Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney has written and spoke extensively. And as a young person, you want to go and examine Walter Rodney's total praxis. Ravi found an interview that Walter Rodney did in 1970, in which he addressed directly the question of race and class in Guyana. And I will share it with you because I think young people like yourself should read it to really understand Walter Rodney. When Walter Rodney was in Guyana from 74 to 80, he didn't raise the question of Black power, although he is the leading Caribbean theoretician on Black power. And I want you all young people to know that. He has a book that's called The Bible of Caribbean Black Power. It's called Groundings with My Brother. He came to Guyana and that work was done. The issue in Guyana was not an issue of Black power. It was an issue, as you correctly said, it was an issue of African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese working people having an authoritarian government that was succeeding in oppressing them as a class, right? And so he intervened at that level. Now let me come to the workers. Rodney's long dead, and the sugar workers. Dr. Clive Thomas, who was part of the commission set up by the government to recommend what to do with sugar, recommended to the government that estates not be closed. I repeat, Professor Clive Thomas, a co-leader of the WPA, recommended to the government that sugar estates not be closed. You can take from there that the WPA was against sugar estates being closed. The rest is not our history.
All right, so let me go to our third guest, our next guest, Mr. Robert Cuffy. So again, I'm going to ask you to keep it brief and let's get to the question. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Michael, for raising that very important question. And I would like to re-raise it because I feel it's unanswered. Because Michael is asking a very important question that gets to this issue of that Walter Rodney speech of the question of race and class in a Guyanese context. Now, before Mr. Dev said that he felt that the Marxist analysis gave short thrift to race in Guyana. But we have to ask the question in the concrete historical circumstance of 2020, how do we make things different? And Michael is asking, why wasn't the opportunity taken by the WPA for a bottom-up struggle as opposed to government intervention to unite those sugar workers, maybe with all those teachers who went on strike? And I think it's very telling, for example, that Mr. Dev, part of his biography is as a business owner, right? So what are your interests as a business owner, Mr. Dev, and what are your interests as an actual member of the sitting government, Mr. Hinds, in this question of race and class in a Guyanese context?
Well, let me answer that because I think when the closure of Wales occurred, because I live on West Coast, Wales on West Bank, when I was in Roar, we had launched a sugar union because we felt the sugar workers were not being well represented. And we had over 5,700 signatures. And I won't get into the details, but we were stymied by technical issues, just like what's happening now, to stymie the will of the people. But be as it may, we have a lot of contacts in Wales. And we made two initiatives on an individual. First of all, I'm in no way, shape, or form have any relationship with this government, nor with the PPP, as a person who comes to the table with a business background. I got in touch with, when Wales occurred, now I want to say the background of Wales. Wales is a very historic sugar estate because fully 40% of the Wales workers are of African descent. People think of sugar as being all Indian. Secondly, Wales has the largest number of farmers, African Guyanese farmers, who are cane farmers, who supply the 30% of cane to Wales estate. So you had an opportunity to bring together the working people of Wales, at least, consciously so, to see their real interest. What I did as a business person, through my contacts in India, I got in touch with a sugar owner, a family that owns sugar estates in India, Maharashtra state. And they have a model in Maharashtra state where the workers they lease the land and they produce the sugar cane. The factories are owned by private interest, and there's a corporation that does all the other tasks like getting fertilizers, transportation, and all the other tasks. I got in touch with this individual, Mr. Deshmukh, and he made an offer for Wales Estate. Myself, my friend Nigel Hughes, ex-leader of the AFC, and Dr. Surendra, who was a member of the AFC and at that time the chairman of the NIS. And I asked President Granger for a meeting that we could have this model work for Wales. He put us in touch with Mr. Gaskin, the business minister, and Mr. Holder, the agricultural minister. And they listened to us, we could check this out, and they threw it out. They were not willing to go that route. They made all kinds of excuses. And then and there, it was my conclusion that the PNC government, and it was the PNC government, did not want to see a solution. And I'll tell you this, and I'll use the expression here, because again, Wales is very, very important. The last set of Africans to come from Africa after slavery had been abolished, but yet other nations were trading in African slaves. Some of them were brought to Guyana as indentured servants, and some of them ended up in Wales. The Africans of that area are very special. In fact, to my surprise and delight, Nigel told me he had some relations there. Nigel Hughes, that is. I know it's a long story, and I tend to get long-winded. But the point is that we made interventions, and each of the interventions was shown that this government was not interested in the people of this country coming together.
And thanks, Ravi. No, I'm claiming. Listen, you again, you ought to be surprised how those estates were closed down. Apparently, you're not impressed that the WPA was not part of the closing down of the estate. Apparently, you are not impressed that 3 elders of the WPA, and Moses Bagwan and Kwai wrote a public letter on behalf of protesting on behalf of the sugar workers, that the closing down on the estate was not correct, and it was having an ill effect on the sugar workers, in effect taking the government to task. David Hinds himself went to Wales with Christopher Ram to take relief to the sugar workers, and a journalist from the Guyana Times interviewed me, and the results of those interviews are in the Guyana Times. I'm asking you all to do some research before you ask, because you're asking, presuming that the WPA did not protest against what happened to the sugar workers. I'm not aware of any movement in favor of the sugar workers. If there was one, I would have been part of it. I knew there were protests organized by GAWU and the PPP. That's their story. I don't know of any broad-based movement. So if you're asking the WPA why it didn't start the movement, I would invite you to come join the WPA and help us to start the movement.
Let me get back to, I want to get back to Ferlin. And again, I know you're a philosopher, young man, but can you keep the question short, please?
Well, I want to quickly follow up with the response Dr. Hinds gave, which was that he wants power sharing because the people vote for the PPP and the PNC, APNU coalition. The curious thing, though, is that I read in a letter of his, or I think there was a letter written with Dr. Hinds quoted, which he gave disparaging remarks towards the PPPC. So I find it kind of perplexing how he would propose power sharing and yet advocate against the PPPC, which, you know, he's articulated forms this ethnic base of Indo-Guyanese. Doesn't that sort of distance Indo-Guyanese further from what he's proposing?
What is this disparaging of the PPP, Ferlin, you're referring to?
Well, there was a piece in Chronicle where you basically essentially got to to some very bitter points about the PPP, that they shouldn't be trusted, they're very opportunistic. Those were the sort of sentiments that you get after reading your comments. So I'm just curious whether, I mean, in a power sharing framework, would you, Dr. David Hinds, be part of that power sharing between a PPP, C, APNU, AFC government? Would you be part of that?
I am not interested in office. I'm not. All right. I am interested in people, and I'm interested in our country. As far as disparaging remarks, I'm equal opportunity person. There are probably more disparaging remarks against the PNC you will find from me than the PPP. Ferlin, my opposition to parties is not opposition to their supporters. I oppose the Black Party. Put my life down for it, for that opposition. And I oppose the Indian Party. I'm opposed to governments that do not do the right thing. In fact, they tell me that I defend Black people against Indians. When Mr. Granger went to BV and, in my estimation, spoke down to Africans, I tell you, you're wrong. I I'm an equal opportunity. All right. I made it very clear on the eve of the election that I wasn't voting for a party. I didn't vote for any party on March 2nd. I said in the column the day before that I was voting to give poor people a path, a path. I thought then that the coalition stood a better chance of giving us a path to a government of national unity. And it was on that premise that I voted for the coalition.
But David, correct me if I'm wrong. You're a voter, but you were also a member on the list of the coalition.
Yeah, I was a candidate. I was a candidate.
So you can't be very impartial if you're a candidate, right? So
I can be impartial. I can be impartial. Nobody directs David Hinds what position. No party, including the WPA, can tell David Hinds what position he must take on those issues. I am independent. I belong to a party. I support a party, but I am not imprisoned by parties. Not me.
Like Charandas, huh? Like Charandas.
But that would make both of you Judases.
Well, I've been called Judases by all and sundry.
All right. So I want to give these young people a chance again. So let me go back to Micheal. And again, Micheal, I know you hang out with a philosopher. So again, so try to keep your question very short and very brief. And after you, whoever responds, then we'll go to a break. Go ahead.
So as it relates to the question that I asked, the reason why I asked is because to me it was an opportunity for the WPA to do a bit more, in my opinion. Indeed, Clive Thomas did say that in the report from the Commission of Inquiry, I think, that he did recommend that the Sugar Estates don't be closed. But barring those sentiments, to me, like, there should have been more done, because it could have been a catalyst to division that a lot of us today really want with Guyana. So yeah, that's just to close off with that. So my next question would be like to Mr. Dev, and do you believe there needs to be a more sense of nationalist identity for Guyanese to come together?
Very, 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 very much so. I have spoken on this issue from the very beginning. But you see, we are caught in a dilemma, and maybe young people can maybe lead us out of this dilemma. The dilemma is that the British foisted on us a model of integration called assimilation, where Africans had to jettison their culture, Indians had to jettison their culture, Amerindians had to jettison their culture, everyone, and you had to become a brown Englishman or a black Englishman, as the case may be. So coming out of that experience, I don't think we have ever totally addressed the point I made in my last program, which is that diversity is a fact of nature. It's a fact of this universe. And to say, e pluribus unum, out of many there be one. No, it must be we are many. How can we become one? Start from the understanding we are many. So if we start from that premise, I think we will, from the very beginning then, always ask the question, am I inclusive? And so therefore, what we proposed as role, when we were, having our 15 minutes of fame back in the day, what we proposed was that we should have a new motto, not one nation, one people, one destiny, which is unity in diversity. That in this diversity, how can we be united? There is no contradiction in being an African Guyanese and being Guyanese. We're all Guyanese. So in fact, our dilemma as Indians was that after we came into a Creole society that had been pretty much formed, the assumptions of Creole society wasn't only the English one. To their credit, they brought in a certain Afro elements. So it is more like an Afro-Anglo culture. And we had to now fit into that. But there's a very great theorist from our own Caribbean, French Caribbean, Glissant. What Glissant said, rather than, for example, seeing ourselves like a taproot, our culture coming out of a single taproot, or from one, or from that African culture, maybe with the English thrown in for good measure. Let us see ourselves as a rhizomatic. A rhizome, as a biologist you will know, a rhizome puts out, I was a biologist once too, a rhizome puts out roots as it grows from its stem, but it puts out roots. So our whole Guyaneseness, everybody will have an equal share into that. And that is part of our dilemma today. That for an Indian, I'll talk for what I know, for an Indian to become Guyanese is to jettison the Indian part of me. So, for example, if I were to sing a song, I was telling David earlier before the program come on, we now through this lockdown talk to all my brothers and sisters. And over the internet with Zoom, we can now sing our Indian songs. A brother of mine, a good friend, passed away, COVID, and I was able to sing a bhajan. Now, if I were in the public space in Guyana, an Indian is thought to be ashamed of that. Man, you can't talk like that. You can't sing a bhajan. What is this nonsense? One fellow actually said that because we plant those jhandas to announce that we have made on worship to God, that jhanda could cause an accident to happen on the East Coast. That is still the kind of thought. So to come back to answer your question, again, I went off, I go on and on, is that yes, we must form a Guyaneseness. And I put forward to people on Guyaneseness that out of an equality, all we want in this country, every ethnic group wants to be equal. Coming out of slavery and indentureship, we want freedom, because as Orlando Patterson said, freedom can only have come, the notion of freedom, out of slavery. When you have taken everything away from that African slave, when you have made him a chattel, and so it's a juxtaposition. So African and Indian, not to the extent of slaves, of course, want freedom. We also want liberty. And these are values that we can rally around as Guyanese. When I was a boy, I grew up in Ifat. I'm still living in Ifat. It's a mixed village. I ate, slept, went to school with my African friends in the African village called Kashwa in Ifat. And the greatest damage that was done to our country is the riots of the 1960s, where we were split and we have never come together, really together. So come back to it, yes, we must have a program of Guyaneseness, and it can be done on values that you don't have to jettison your cultural heritage. Afro-Guyanese have had to look at it, and that's why when I first came back and met Music Guyana, and he's like an icon within Roar. That's the interesting thing. But come back. Yes, I'm done.
All right. So okay, we have to pay the bill. So we're going to take a little break here, and we'll go back to the control room. Devin, it's all yours when we come back.
Did you know the FBI warned against using public Wi-Fi? And hackers using public Wi-Fi can download viruses and steal all of your private information. Let Globespan help you protect against hackers by providing you with a virtual private network or VPN. Keep all of your data hidden and protected, including sensitive information, documents, bank account numbers, and more. The FBI recommends using a VPN, and Globespan can help provide one for you. It's very simple and easy to use. Call Globespan today. In Georgetown, call 225-9054. In West Coast, call 269-0141. Or in the United States, call 718-551-3290. You are now able to work from home or from anywhere with a cloud computer. No more worrying if you can't get to the office. Access all of your files and work in an efficient manner with a cloud computer. Best of all, no waiting for a technician to show up to fix all of your computer crashes or viruses, or any computer problem. No more worrying about power surge or losing your files. Let Globespan set up a cloud computer for you to work from home or anywhere. Access with a laptop, iPad, or any device that you may have. You can set up your own passwords and keep all your information hidden. Globespan will set up all the antivirus programs, automatic backups, and configure a computer to fit your needs. Globespan has technicians in the US and Guyana to assist you. Call Globespan today. In Georgetown, call 225-9054. In West Coast, call 269-0141. Or in the United States, call 718-551-3290.
Oh, let's go back to Robert. The next question is from Mr. Robert Duffy.
He had to leave.
Mr. Robert actually had to leave. He didn't have much more time with us.
Okay, so let's. I want to come back to gentlemen. We'll come back to your questions in a couple of minutes, but I want to come back to this whole, question of federalism, right? The evolution of power. I know we started talking about it at the last session. So let me ask Dr. Hinds, how do you feel about federalism as a sort of a power sharing mechanism where the different regions in Guyana, would have more power as opposed to having all of or the majority of the power center in Georgetown?
No, I'm not opposed to federalism in principle. And I have some difficulty in seeing how federalism would lead to the feeling of sharing of power by all. And Ravi and I have talked about this over the years. However, I think everything should be placed on the table. I think executive power sharing should be placed on the table. Federalism should be placed on the table. Some of us have talked about a vertical power sharing that goes right down to the villages. I am, for example, a fan of a return to the village councils. So I think everything should be put on the table. And let us see what is the best formula to start with. I think these are things that we've got to evaluate as we go on, and we may see the need to broaden. We may see the need to string them sometimes. We may also, at some point, see the need to end power sharing. If, as Ravi thinks, and a lot of people think that at some point we will develop this Guyanese nationalism where ethnicity will go away and we will have this non-ethnic Guyaneseness, we may not have need for power sharing. I share Ravi's view about Guyanese nationalism. I think it's aspirational. For me, I prefer the motto, many people, one destiny. We have not attained nationhood in the cultural sense. We live in a nation state and so forth, but in the cultural sense, we've not been allowed to go back to 1953. The UC Guyana, Martin Carter, and I think Rory Westmus may have supported it, proposed to the PPP leadership that they do not try to win the 1953 election, that they try for a minority, and they use their position in the still colonial government at that time in order to work among the people and to develop the inter-ethnic solidarity that was there. The majority, it seems, went against that proposal. They won the election, and we now know the rest is history. I come again to 1961 when Guyana again proposed that they have joint premiership. Both leaders rejected it, and we know the rest is history. We have a history of sometimes going ahead of ourselves in terms of political correctness, and then pay the price later, and then blame something else. This problem has been there from the time our peoples start coming to what is now Guyana. The circumstances in which they came, the time in which they came, these factors have led us, and we are guilty. We are guilty of not paying enough attention to bringing our nation together, doing the work on the ground, in bringing our nation together, having these conversations like we're having here. And we've put more store on electoral politics. We're about to make the same mistake in 2020. We are looking for an electoral solution alone and not paying attention to other solutions that are put on the table. And I think we are running the risk of kicking the ball again down the road, but this time with worse consequences than before.
So, Mr. Deb, you want to respond to that? Because I know you have been a proponent of federalism.
Well, two things. One would be that I think events have overtaken us is one. Then the second one is the whole matter of choice. Right now, talking about federalism and power sharing and all these other notions, we're like the old scholastics of medieval times arguing how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, you know. It's immaterial. Will the two sides accept any of this? Because at this juncture, this is where events have overtaken us, which is that we have come to me at a happy juncture, which I never thought would have happened because so many Indians have emigrated. Indians have moved from 51% in 1980 to less than 39% today. We are now a nation of minorities. And if the PNC were to win, they cannot win it with just Afro-Guyanese votes. They will get maybe all of it. Similarly, the PPP cannot win this election with all of the Indian votes, if that were possible, which I don't think it is. So what it means, therefore, at long last, we are presented with a fait accompli, which doesn't call for too much theorizing. What it calls for, if the PNC had done what it could have done when it went into coalition politics, which is to treat its coalition constituents with respect, I don't think we would have arrived at this pass right now. So what I'm saying, let us have this election, let us have the results of this election. Let us give the Guyanese people who have voted for either one the opportunity to see how we can work it out. We cannot ignore the ethnic question. One of the points I had made all the way back to Mr. Desmond Hoyt, who I had long conversations. People forget I was in the opposition in my 5 years in Parliament. I had long discussions with Mr. Desmond Hoyt, even longer conversations with Mr. Robert Corbyn. We talked a lot about these things. My suggestion was, in each of these parties, why don't you have an ethnic caucus? In the PPP, why don't you have an African caucus or an Amerindian caucus? That within the PPP that can talk frankly outside of your major constituency about concerns of that, just like we have in America. I lived 20 years in America after high school. The world didn't fall apart that you had a black caucus and a Latino caucus. Similarly, as I told Mr. Hoyt, have an Indian caucus and have an Amerindian caucus with your core constituency. In fact, a joke, Mr. Corbyn once told me, he said, man, he named a particular Indian in the party. He said, man, when a man go on stage, he more Rasta than me. That's another question. He wasn't willing to talk the Indian talk. Robert did tell me. So to come back to the point I'm making, we need, I believe, that right now, if we were to have honest brokers within each party who can talk frankly so they're not seen as tokens, as right now you're being seen. Secondly, the whole ethnic impact statement. When I talk about equality, I don't think we all have become one mishmash, one melange. We don't need to. I was talking of equality in this public sphere, in what the state gives. In this Guyanese state that we have observed, let us all have equality. Economic equality, Afro-Guyanese, how do we have more equitable? I've always told Indians, you might, because of your Indian immigrant economic drive, you might, certain things are more easy for you. The slave never had any incentive to save, to put aside anything. What would they save for? They were slaves, they couldn't earn anything. You have this structural situation. But the point is, we have to do what we can, so as best as we can, you have some kind of equity in economic distribution. Those are things we can put, and that will come out of an ethnic impact statement. So, for example, and of course here, I know I'm carrying on again, if we have agriculture, right? I had no problem with the PNC government having $2.6 billion set aside for agricultural projects in 4 African villages of Ithaca, Buxton, BV, and Mocha. I have no problem with that, but let it be done openly, because as it was done, sugar workers told me, how come we are not getting any land to plant? How come we're not getting any marketing? Because that package, 2.6 billion, came with marketing of crops, contacts, all kinds of things with it. How come? You'll always do it. So I will say, let us do this thing openly, that we can have ethnic programs, ethnic policies. Thank you. I hope I've caught myself there.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I want to come back to Ferlin in a minute. So, but since David is saying, just out of curiosity, you were saying we should put everything on the table. Should partition in the modern sense, in terms of, let's say, for instance, South Sudan breaking away from Sudan, should partition also be on the table?
No.
Okay.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
All right, so let's go back to Ferlin. Again, can you keep your question short, because we're coming, close to the end. So briefly.
Right. So I find it kind of unfortunate that most of the power sharing discussion has been focused on empowering already empowered politicians, call them the political class. And I don't see any factor being considered for the average Guyanese, the citizens, the people who empower these selected few people into government. So my question is very general here, and it comes back to what Mr. Dev is talking about, proportional representation. Is there, I mean, people vote for parties, but it's the political parties who elect the people's representatives. Is there room in the power sharing discussion for empowering the citizen to become involved in governance?
Yes, there is, and we have made, and there are many changes. You see, the literature is very vast out there. We have to see where the shoe pinches for us. Take, for example, the list system that we have in proportional representation. The list system that we have in Guyana is an open list. So you have a list of candidates, and the leader can choose which of those candidates goes into parliament. Now, everybody wants to get into parliament of their 65 candidates. So they will do whatever the leader wants to get into there. Secondly, once you get in there, everybody wants to be a minister. So they will do their darnest to follow the line, toe the line. And secondly, legislation was introduced to prevent crossing of the floor, to have charandasses. You get me, if Charandas had just mentioned that he wants to vote against it, he would have been thrown out there. He would have been a fool if he were to have told the party. And people put up as a great, how to put it, a sin on his part. How come you didn't tell the party? Well, the party would have thrown him out. The point is that we can look at the list system, make it a closed list, which is that the list that is put up tells you the order of preference, depending on the number of seats, who will get into parliament.
Make it a closed list or open list? I believe it's closed right now, so it should be open.
Well, right? We reverse, right? Maybe I'm miscategorizing. But the point is that it should be the one where, in the order that you are presented, that's how you get into parliament. It takes away that kind of make or break godlike power of the leader. The second one, and we tried it in 2000, which is, and I was part of that, Roe presented a whole constitution to the committee. But one of it was to make geographical representation. So from 65, we went to 25, must be geographically chosen. But we didn't follow through with that. They're not really chosen geographically. They come from a list. The theory of geographical representation is that within, you call it a multi-member constituency, let's say like West Coast, where I'm from, right? You should have people competing from West Coast, separate outside of the party. You understand? And you will be able to choose one of those. And there's electoral changes you can come. I don't want to go on and on, but there's alternative voting where you can have that. If I can give it a preference, okay, this is my number one choice, but this is my number two choice, number three choice. So if all the number one choice, nobody gets over 50%, you then go to number two. who was the next popular leader. So that in a sense, it is a centripetal device which tells people to moderate your rhetoric and all that. So there's many of these things that we put on, but for what I will tell you, you're young, and I wouldn't want to break anybody's mind, as they say. We try this. I quit my job in 1988, right? Never went back, never really worked for 32 years. And these two parties, as David said, you're not going to get rid of these two parties. The people have chosen, that's the nature of ethnic politics. So their core will remain. We have to find ways of influencing the parties, so we can't be too radical in what we are suggesting. It ain't going to work. It won't be accepted. It's not going to get off. That's one of the lessons that I will. Let's go have incremental change. Let us start with whoever is elected, let them go into office, and let us now make them change within their structures to let people have some power.
Gentlemen, somebody forgot to feed the dogs. There's a lot of barking in the background. So let's go to Micheal.
Can I take a stab at Ferlin's thing? I'll be short. I'll be short. And I join with Ravi, Ferlin. Yes, we're talking about power sharing among the elites. In my book on power sharing, I discuss horizontal power sharing among the elites, and then we talk about vertical power sharing the elites and the peoples in their communities. They've put on the table federalism, persons like myself put on the table a return of village councils and so forth. Here is one of the fortunate thing, Ferlin. We have a lot of literature on power sharing in Guyana. Starting with Guyana, I will recommend to you that you go back and read Guyana's original document from 1961. It was printed in something called The Villager. I can share it with you. Coming right through, we have a lot of literature. And I think young persons like yourself should engage that literature, right? Literature from the PPP, literature from the PNC, the WPA, from Dagan, from Guyana, from people like Sherwood Lowe, from Ravi Dev. There's a lot of literature. And sometimes when we speak, we assume that you guys have engaged that literature. So the reason we don't talk about empowerment to the bottom, because the immediate discourse is what is before us. But we have done that. We have done all of that work. It's just about now engaging the politicians and letting them understand that there is another opportunity to reach for something different from what we have.
I read those literature.
All right, so let's go to Micheal. Can you, again, please keep it short?
Yeah, so as it relates to East Indians, there is a sense that the caste system is basically partially responsible for the racism on that part, basically. So my question to Mr. Dev is like, what would you see being put in place to mitigate some of that? Because it would be from a more cultural standpoint if we go on to that basis. So how would we as citizens, as an East Indian person, move away from that is being input?
See, that is one of the red herrings that has been unfortunately thrown into the Guyana discourse. There's a great amount of literature. I don't think I'm amazed that people could ignore it as to the formation of race. We could start with our own Eric Williams, who talked about race in the Caribbean, race and slavery, how race as a social construct was invented, interestingly enough, by the Enlightenment philosophers like Kant and all of them, who put black people as beyond the pale. Say black people have a different kind of blood. They're not even humans. De Las Casas said, well, they don't have enough souls. So if we bring them over as slaves, they we're doing them a favor. We're exposing them and they might want to have a slave. And I'm always amazed, for example, at African Guyanese. Look at this Christian history on our still, anyhow, let me not go down that road right now. But to come back to the point I'm making, race is a social construct that was created out of the European Enlightenment and all of humanity, in fact, all of nature. There's something called a chain of being. a chain of being which is from the very top. You know who's at the very top of the chain of being? A white man. And as you go down now within the races group, you have the African as lowest among humans, because when they finally concede the African was a human. So Indians now, and some of them are very proud to say, well, I am brown. You know, we now have accepted degradation. But that is a Christian notion, this whole chain of being, because it gives you a hierarchical mindset. Somehow there's a high, there's an intermediate, there's a low. So let me take away that whole thing of it, because in India, for example, there's a fellow named Micheal, who in 1832 wrote what is called the Micheal Minute, to impose a hegemony over the Indians using racial categories. So this became imperial policy throughout the empire. So, for example, they founded 4 universities in India. When they then divided up Africa later in 1882, you know, the division of Africa, they did the same thing. And we have our Queen's College, which you attended, and we had the Queen's Royal out in Trinidad, where they would make us brown and black Englishmen. But in that hierarchy, we are always second class. And when we accept it, we are second rate to this day. So to come back to the whole notion of the caste system, caste is a notion that developed out of India, that had thousands of years of history, of their own history, with the Mughals and all of that. So I don't want to use a whole long discourse, but to our credit in Guyana, when we came, all of us, we got rid of caste because you were all thrown into a plantation where you were all catching your tail, as we say. I still live in the house where my dad came out of the logis. I was the last of my siblings who was born in the logis and came here. So this whole notion of caste, you know how my wife is of Brahmin origin. I am of a lower caste origin. That is gone. I know that because I'm, as a historian, we went to the archives and you look it up. But very few Indians have any castes in them. It's all mixed, because now there might be some who are priests and some still try to be quote unquote Brahmins. But it's a dying breed, very few. The majority of even the Pandits, the priests, they call Purohits in Guyana, are all of non-Brahmin, because you don't know who you are. So that notion of people still having caste playing a role is totally irrelevant to this discourse. Because, for example, when I went to India, and I've gone there very often, they will go left, right, and sideways trying to find out what caste I am, by my name, by my this, by my that, you know, your practices. They don't know. I don't know. Well, I did. I went to the archives. But the point is, so to come back to it, I think that's something, come back to the Guyanese-ness. Just like how Africans, we don't know, even if you're Africa, you don't know if you're from Ghana, you're Yuri from Ghana, or you're Igbo from Nigeria, Eastern Nigeria. All of Western Africa was brought here. They became one ethnic group, similarly the Indians. And a lot of that old baggage has been jettisoned. I'll close with this. As late as 1937, there was something called the Arya Samaj movement. My father is an Arya Samaj. There were great Arya Samajes coming out of Boston that had a reformation movement within local Hinduism, talking about caste, talking about the place of Indian women, talking about education. And it is not a coincidence that some of Jagan's biggest helpers were from the Arya Samaj movement. They already had a notion, not from class analysis, but from the reform movement within Hinduism. Pandit Sama Prasad out of Buxton, and that whole family, strong Buxtonians, and you won't believe how strong they are as Buxtonians. So I close with that. I think that's a red herring, and these are things that we need to put on the national discourse a lot more frontally.
So I think
not so long term.
Okay, thank you.
So I think we kind of shifted a little bit. So, you know, we're getting close to the end. So I'm going to have Ferlin ask one more brief question, and then we'll move on.
So I think my last question will be concerning the whole idea of transitioning to a new governance model. And I understand that you know, the literature is rich, and you know, I've dived into the literature. I've read most of our cherished works, by various authors before, Guyanese authors, including your works, Dr. David Hinds. I've read some of Mr. Dev's works, the most prominent ones. But my last question is this. Given the current circumstances of Guyana's ethnic deadlock, is power sharing necessarily the sort of question we should be focused on, whether there should be power sharing or whether there should be a sort of ethnic compromise between these two major parties? Or should the question be more focused on empowering citizens to become part of their government, to become responsible for legislation, to vote on legislation, to even perhaps give checks and balances within the parliamentary chambers whenever they find their representatives to be, maybe a bit too extreme on certain legislation or proposals, for instance.
All of that.
Okay,
all,
excellent.
All. It's not one or the other. All of that. And I mean, the fixation on power sharing, but those who are advancing power sharing is not advancing it as an end in itself. I'm not advancing it as the cure all for everything. It's advancing it as a formula to give us a space to do all those things that we're talking about. We're not able to do the Westminster checks and balances and empowering the people to think that we're not able to do those things because of the ethnic divide. And so we're trying to find a framework in which formal Western democracy, which we've inherited, can operate. The fact is that those things you're talking about, checks and balances and all those things, are part of the Westminster form of governance. And they've not led to anything positive in Guyana because of the ethnic barriers. So when we talk about power sharing, we talk about a mechanism to give us space that we can have elections, competitive elections, and not wait 60 days for a result. That we can have competitive elections where all the participants accept the results. That we can have a form of government where all ethnic groups feel that they have a say and a stake in. Those things that you're talking about is where we want to go, but we want a path. And so power sharing, executive power sharing, is seen as that path, not an end in itself. Let me follow up on Ravi. And I'm calling Guyana name a lot tonight because I think his contributions to the discourse on ethnicity and race in Guyana are underrated and not properly studied. Guyana introduced a concept in 1998 called no guilty race, in which he was the only prominent African Guyanese, after Ravi Dev and a group called GIF had mounted an investigation into Indians who were beaten on the streets of Georgetown after the 1997 election. And Guyana welcomed that investigation because he himself had done it in the 1960s. And he has called for it right now, and Freddie Kissoon has taken him to task for doing it, right? And out of that came a book by Guyana called No Guilty Race, in which he introduced the concept. And he argues in that work that both races or both major ethnic groups have been aggressive to each other. But there have been moments in our history when they have come together in solidarity. And so in the end, he's arguing, saying one race is guilty and the other one is innocent is unhelpful to a national solution. Hence the notion of no guilt race, accepting the fact that there have been moments of aggression against each other. So Guyana has constantly been looking for a path out of this dilemma. Does it mean
All
that
right, David,
both of us,
can you please wrap it up?
I'm wrapping it up. Does it mean that we do not embrace the notions of Westminster democracy and so on? We're arguing that has not led to a solution. It has not led to the kind of harmonious society. In fact, it has undermined our harmony. We see on the cricket field when a Chandra Paul goes out there with the baton in his hand, he makes us all become Guyanese. Or a Carl Hooper going out there and dancing down to the Australian spinner and hitting him for six. They make all of us Guyanese. It is at the political level that undermines those openings for the kind of national unity that we're talking about. And so what we're looking for is a path. It's a path that allows for the ownership and security of all ethnic groups in Guyana.
All right, so we're coming. So Dev, I'll give you a chance. 1 second. So we're coming to the end of our show here. So I want to thank Micheal and Ferlin for being with us, and of course Robert, who left earlier. And hopefully you can join us again later. But since we're coming to the end here, we're going to close. But I'm going to give Mr. Dev a chance to respond, if you can do it briefly, and then make a closing statement. And then I'll come back to David to make a closing statement.
I'll use my turn to make my statement, to respond, and also to make a closing statement. First of all, Mr. Quayana, in his book, No Guilty Race, was a repost to my paper, An Etiology of an Ethnic Riot.
Yes.
And with all due respect to Mr. Quayana, who we have the greatest of respect for, as I pointed out in the public discourse, he really was fighting a straw man. He created a straw man. I never said there was a guilty race. He created a straw man and did a good job of destroying that straw man. But as you know, we don't do that. It's not done. But to come back to the point that Ferlin is making, this is where I think, there's something called the Occam's razor. Let us not make a solution too complicated than is necessary to what the circumstances demand. I come back to the point that history have given us a situation where we are now a nation of minorities. Neither of the two parties can win without, whether by a coalition bringing in votes or through people voting for the party. In whichever way, they have to reach across the ethnic divide. Let us now try this new opportunity that has been given to us. Because if you act rationally, you want to come back into office, you would not want to shoot yourself in the foot, which is what the PNC did. So I don't want to again cast too much aspersions, but it's unbelievable what Mr. Granger did at his turn of the wheel. But I would like to believe that we can now go forward. And as Mr. Ferlin is saying, let us focus on actual helping individuals in ways that they could understand. So they can answer the question 5 years down, am I better off under this government than I was 5 years ago at the end of that? And I'm saying the only way we can know that is if we have ethnic impact statements. Because as I'll say again, I'm not touting for the PPP, but all the household income and expenditure statements from 1992 to 2006, the last one we had, show that Afro-Guyanese progress in the same manner out of poverty than all the other groups. And the only group that was left behind are the Amerindians. But we must do that more often. Let us measure where we are, and in going forward, what are the impact? And sometimes we have to not do maybe the economic thing, because we have to do the ethnic thing. So if, for example, I once had a conversation with Lincoln Lewis. Yeah, Lincoln and I used to talk. I went up, we go to Critchlow College, and we talk about the same problem. How can Afro-Guyanese benefit from agriculture? So he told me, said, Ravi, Afro-Guyanese, let us say we open up agricultural land in the intermediate savannas. They're not going to go like you have Blackbush Polder and do that. We'll have to create a township because blacks are socialized to live together to a little party and what have you. It's not stereotype. That's where they are, he told me. And therefore, the form of the agricultural development, you'll have to take into cognizance African cultural habits coming out of slavery. So what I want to say is that we'll have to look very and tailor this to improving actual people. God has given us the opportunity. You wouldn't believe it now that oil has gone negative in price, but we have an opportunity after we come out of this to have the wherewithal to do all these things to help our Ghanaians. So my closing statement, I would say, it's you young people who have to now carry forward this discourse and persuade whoever gets into office that you can't neglect the other side, and if they are rational, they will do the right thing, once again, to quote Spike Lee.
David, closing statement?
It is sometimes very difficult to speak frankly on the ethnic condition of our country, the ethnic condition of the various ethnic groups, in the atmosphere that we have now, where we are competing and we are fighting. Because when people are competing, they lose a sense of rationality, which they will get back once the dust is settled. The thing. Listen, we are at a historical moment, and I'm picking up from Ravi there, the moment of oil and gas and the wealth, however small it would be. And for us to feel that we can have an election and not take into consideration that fact is to be fools. And we've been foolish many times. And my suspicion is that we're being foolish at the moment. Ignoring the subtext, sometimes convenient. I think a lot of people are conveniently ignoring the subtext. I can tell you from what's happening in the African Guyanese. After slavery, the African Guyanese never get a deal, a real deal. The plantation owners jettison whatever opportunities that came out of the village movement in order to bring about empowerment for African Guyanese. Oh God, I have to call Quyan again. There's a little book that's called by the UCM Quyan called Scars of Bondage, which is a good read, right? Independence came, and the question of opportunity for African Guyanese again, to realize the dream of post-emancipation. And that got scuttled in the fighting, the party fighting. So some of the progressive ideas that were put forward under the early PNC were scuttled once the whole question of free and fair elections and authoritarianism came into being. And for African Guyanese, the coming of oil wealth is another opportunity for them to realize their dreams coming out of the plantation. All right? Unfortunately, all of this has now got caught up in this impasse that we have. And the way in which we are talking about the impasse as though these other things don't exist. I'm giving the African Guyanese narrative. Ravi will give Indian Guyanese narrative. But for us to behave as though these elections have nothing to do with those things is as dangerous. It's as dangerous as trying to create one winner over the other. We are making a big mistake in believing this thing is about some majoritarian democracy and some winner and some loser. But Ravi is saying, we have passed that. We've passed that. The contradictions have brought us to this moment. And it's begging us. It's begging us because it's pregnant with a lot of history. It's begging us, please, out of this impasse, let something positive come out of it. I have to be hopeful because I'm a Guyanese. I have to be hopeful because I come from a culture that is hopeful. If you are a slave, in order to be free, you have to imagine freedom. You have to imagine a new world. And we are trying to imagine something beyond this recount. And we are being shouted out and called all kinds of names. All right? But we, African Guyanese, we have constantly had to imagine something different. We are asking our Indian brothers and sisters to understand that if we think beyond the present, it is because we've always had to do that. Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, we've gone way beyond our allotted time. I know it's late at night. I think it's past my bedtime, but I'm glad we have some young people here tonight with us. And I do hope, and I really sincerely hope, that we can continue with this discussion, because I think what we heard here tonight and in the previous nights, I think it is important that we have this discourse and we continue with this discourse. And hopefully maybe Chris Ram is wrong. I know he said we may not know the results of this thing until the end of August, which is a long time to wait, but hopefully, we can be a little optimistic and we can see light at the end of the tunnel. So with that said, I will invoke our national poet, Martin Carter, who said, if we're not all engaged, then we're all going to be consumed. So hopefully we're all engaged in this struggle, and hopefully we can see a better world somewhere in the near future. So having said that, all of you out there who are looking at this show, please stay safe and be well. And on behalf of Globespan, I'd like to wish all of you good night. Thank you.
Thank you.